Hi there everyone, Nubkeks here, and in today's video I'm going to do a tier list of what I think are the best bosses in the Mythic Eternal Palace raid in World of Warcraft Battle for Azeroth. So obviously we've been doing a bunch of tier list videos for Heroes of the Storm on the channel in the last week or two. And seeing as we just picked up our kill on Mythic Azshara, got cutting edge for ourselves, and you can of course check out actually the kill videos for every single one of these bosses if you want on the channel. But yeah, I thought this would be a great time. You know, it is actually the last week of patch 8.2.5, I suppose. So the Azshara patch. So yeah, it's kind of the perfect time to reflect and look back on the tier and see what was actually good and what wasn't. So let's dive into it, and we're going to rank these guys from the bottom up. So starting with the worst and then ending with what I thought were the best bosses. So the first boss I'm going to put in here, which I think was overall the worst boss in the instance, is the Radiance of Azshara fight. You know, obviously the meme going around was that it was just the Wrath of Azshara from the Eye of Azshara dungeon from Legion. And it did take a lot of its mechanics and a lot of design from that. It wasn't the most original boss at all. It was also a very simple boss, a very easy boss. Kind of the gimmick of this guy was that you, for the most part, the strategy most people use was you just stack up. It creates tornadoes underneath you, and when it creates the tornado, you just move your group to the side, and the tornado will spawn, and you'll basically have left it behind. There are some dispel mechanics and stuff, but nothing too fancy. It was basically you're dropping off these danger patches behind you, and then just moving around. One of the things I definitely didn't like about the boss, well, several things. You know, number one, actually, I thought that while the boss looks really cool, it's a cool design. Like, he's an absolutely massive boss in the center of this big watery pool, and you're fighting him in a small little ring around him, surrounded by water. I feel though that, you know, the WoW kind of struggles to capture the scale of that. And oftentimes, instead of actually being able to see the boss that you're fighting, you're mostly just looking at, you know, probably just where you're standing, to be honest. You don't even look at the boss at all for the entire fight because it's just not relevant. You're just looking at those tornadoes. So that's a bit of a downside. The bigger downside, though, is that, well, there just wasn't too much interesting happening. I thought the intermission was the only difference between Mythic and Normal, or Mythic and Heroic, excuse me, where you'd get 2 ads spawning in the intermission instead of 1. So you just split your group in half, and then you're basically doing the same thing that you would do anyway. You might have even split your group in half in the first place so that you'd have to move slightly less with the tornadoes. But yeah, it essentially played exactly the same as it did on the lower difficulties. And I don't know, it just wasn't that original, that new, that exciting. It was okay. It's not an F tier boss. You know, I think it's fine that it's in there, but for me, it's pretty much a filler boss. And yeah, that's the Radiance of Azshara. That's the only boss I'm actually going to put in the D tier. We're going to move up next into the C tier. So for me, in the C tier, I'm going to put in the Blackwater Behemoth. Now, I know a lot of people don't actually like this guy. You know, certainly when we were going into the raid, people were hating on the Blackwater Behemoth a lot. Like, I remember Preach's videos and stuff were absolutely ripping into this. I actually thought it was a decent fight. You know, C-tier fight. I think it's okay. One thing I really liked about this boss was the fight arena. I thought it was really cool, where you're on, you know, one platform to fight the boss at the start, and then you have to swim over to the other platform. And it was really beautiful, actually. You have all these glowing jellyfish bobbing up and down and swimming around in the water. You can just sort of weave your way through them. I thought it was, you know, it's obviously not very hard, but I thought it was a really cool and just visually awesome, boss arena and place to fight a boss. It gave you a real cool sense of scale, the feeling of being underwater, or well, you literally were underwater. I just thought they did a great job with that. I enjoyed the pufferfish mechanic as well. That was obviously pretty much just about the only strategy to the fight, was that you had 2 pufferfish in each platform, so you had to kill the pufferfish and take a buff, and that buff would allow you to be healed. Without that buff, you couldn't be healed. So the timing was obviously pretty much just in when do you kill that second pufferfish and refresh your buff. So that was kind of like the skill check of the fight, is can you see when your buff's going to expire, kill the next pufferfish, grab it, and go. It was an extremely easy boss. I think we killed it on Mythic like week 1 or I think it was week 1 in about 2 or 3 pulls. Like, it was ridiculously easy. The Mythic mechanic was again very easy but quite fun. I think it added a lot to the fight. though being very simple, which I think is appropriate for like boss number 2 or 3, where it did like a big laser beam on somebody, and then a few seconds later that beam would zap for massive damage, but it would be split across everybody who soaked the beam. So immunities could just solo it, or you could kind of stack and soak it. But of course, as you moved throughout the fight, the platforms got smaller and smaller, so it was harder to actually stack effectively, because the boss would also do these little chain lightning zaps if you stack too much. So yeah, I thought it was a fine fight. No, nothing spectacular, nothing amazing, but like a decent solid one. I mean, pretty much the only criticism I actually have is that the fish himself looked kind of boring. I thought the fish could have a much more interesting visual design. And it could have just been like, you know, welcome to Eternal Palace. It's a simple boss, but like, wow, look, he looks incredible. The arena is really fun and looks great. You know, it's a nice, easy gimme boss at the start, but yeah. So that's my thoughts on Blackwater Behemoth. It was all right. It wasn't too bad. C tier. In the C tier as well for me, I'm going to put Sakul. I did not like Sakul too much. Now, interestingly enough, I think most players in my raid team did like Sakul. For me, though, there's a lot of things I found quite frustrating about this boss. So obviously you have the tentacles, which are like the one-shot mechanic, essentially. A big tentacle will spawn. You have a portal. You're in a big circular arena. There'll be a portal will spawn, and a big tentacle will shoot out across the arena. And if it hits you, it is effectively a one-shot. It will do massive damage and knock you out of the circle, where you'll take, again, massive damage. So you're basically, for the most part, just dead. And then on Mythic, you have 2 other portals which spawn after it, and more tentacles. So quite a good chunk of the arena gets covered with tentacles, which I thought was a fine mechanic. I certainly would say I found it a little bit frustrating, because it is a sort of one-shot mechanic. So, you know, a lot of progress on Sakul was, you know, a good chunk of pulls were simply getting people used to dodging tentacles. And it's not something that you could particularly do very much to help about. Like, you could call to help a little bit, but for the most part, it was an individual mechanic thing. And these individual mechanics that are one-shots, for me, are a little bit frustrating. You know, I'd rather it did a big chunk of damage, rather than necessarily being a one-shot. But second last boss of the instance, I think I can also understand it with it being quite difficult. I did enjoy the difficulty of the fight, I will say that. It had some difficult healing moments. It had difficult DPS checks that you had to make and really organize and think about. And interesting movement for tanks and controlling the ads as well for the off-tank. I thought that stuff was pretty cool. One of the biggest things I didn't like, though, was how the damage interacted with triggering different phases. So, like, originally when we started pulling the boss, we were doing a damage stop strategy, where you have to stop DPS basically to ensure that you're phasing the boss at the right time, because otherwise you have these overlaps which happen really badly. Essentially, like, the tentacle mechanic would fire off on a timer, but then other boss mechanics like Dread, which were these, you have to dispel, and they do a big burst of raid-wide damage when you do these 4 dispels on Mythic. The problem with that was that the timer would change depending on when you phase. And also other mechanics would also change timers depending on when you phased him. And he phased at certain HP percentage thresholds. So you'd have to push each threshold at specific times within specific windows, small windows, to ensure you didn't get those bad overlaps, which would be almost impossible to deal with. So that's quite annoying, to be honest with you. It's quite frustrating. Number one, you know, getting people to stop DPS, or then at the same time getting people to do enough DPS at the right time, it's just a little bit of a hassle, to be honest. Ultimately, the strategy we ended up using was like the speed kill strategy, which became possible, I think, obviously towards the end of the tier when people had more gear, where you just basically DPS him as much as possible, and it just barely lines up to work out okay. You can just about kill him. So that was actually quite fun. So there's definitely like a bit of a toss-up there. It's like, okay, with a ton of gear, you can speed kill strat Zakul, and you can melt him down really quickly and not have to worry about the overlaps. But for the most part, you are considering that stuff, and it's a hassle. And let me say this, this is me not liking the fight very much, and I'm playing a Shadow Priest who got to do Delirium Realm all the time, which is where you go into the zone, you get mega haste, and you're kind of dotting everything up. Yeah, like, nah, it was just okay. To be honest, there are a lot of things that were just kind of clunky and a little bit annoying and frustrating. Actually, one big thing that frustrated me as the raid leader was that, well, you know, if I go into Delirium Realm, I can't see what's happening in the other realms. So when they're messing stuff up, it's a real hassle for me to actually get footage and see what's actually happening there. That's really annoying. Or likewise, if I'm in that normal realm, it's difficult for me to see what's happening in the Delirium Realm and work out what's going wrong there and all that. That was a pain in the butt. But hey, it had some cool ideas, but it's frustrating for me. Okay, and then that's it for the C tier. We're going into the B tier next. So these are some of the, I think the last 5, these bosses here, the last 5 we're going to place are some of the better ones. So in the B tier, I'm going to put in Orgas OA. I liked a lot about Orgas OA, I have to say. Apart from one aspect of the fight. But the fundamental parts of the fight that I did like, I enjoyed the DPS and the DPS checks. So you're essentially just tunneling Orgas OA, who's mostly just sitting there. So you're just wailing on him and doing as much damage as you can, because the more damage you do, the better. Fantastic. Then he spawns in these 3 Zoetroid ads every now and then. So again, you could just cleave and dot those down. And again, just like kind of kill them relatively as quickly as possible. It's pretty fantastic. And then you've got like a dance mechanic every maybe 2 or 3 times per phase, where he puts down these big puddles and you've got to dodge the puddles. That was quite fun. Very simple, but very satisfying. The interesting mechanic of the fight, of course, was the debuff, Dribbling Ichor. So he applies this to more and more people over the course of the phase, and then he does a Chain Lightning cast, which chains off of people who have that debuff. So basically I had a spreadsheet made for this, like a paint file, where I basically had positions for every single person in the raid marked out. So if you had that debuff, when it came to the Chain Lightning, you had to get to your position, and your position was specific for you, and that was where you wouldn't Chain Lightning to anybody else. So there was a really cool sort of dance effect, where over the course of the fight, you know, more and more people would have to spread out, get in position, and then collapse back in. It was a really big healing check to actually deal with that. It was very tough for healers. So I think for healers, it was a really fun fight. You know, you could do quite a lot of damage at the start of the phase, and then start ramping up your healing and really coordinate your healing cooldowns. I thought for DPS, it was fun too. What I didn't like was the tanking, and that was a big frustration for us, was that this was a 3-tank fight. Well, here's the thing. I think for a lot of guilds, you don't necessarily have 3 good like tank mains to actually put in there, and that was a problem for us, is that we just didn't have that. So it was quite awkward to deal with that. I'm just not a huge fan, I'll be honest, of those 3-tank bosses. I prefer, you know, 2-tank bosses is just more realistic with the typical roster. So that was kind of annoying, and also like the tank balance was a bit off. Like whenever we had Brewmaster, and Brewmaster was super good at dealing with the tank mechanic. It was an interesting idea where Orgas OA hits really hard, it stacks a debuff on you which reduces damage taken. So when you initially pull him and taunt him, you take tons of damage and you have to use CDs to survive. But then as your debuffs build up, it actually gets easier and easier to tank. But of course, if you get to like 10 stacks, you instantly die, so you have to tank swap because of that. But yeah, you just couldn't pick up all the little Zoetroids with the tank swap. It's just impossible unless you're Brewmaster again. So that was definitely a little bit annoying for sure. But apart from that, I liked the fight. It had a really nice intermission as well. We have to run down a little spiral staircase kind of thing, and there's Zoetroids, and there's eggs exploding and everything going on. Like ichor dripping from the ceiling. It was really cool and really fun little stairway to run down. And then had a great final phase, which is basically phase 1 again. But now you also had Naga spawning in, so you kind of had to kill off some Naga, deal with a few extra mechanics. So it was a really good enrage type phase. Like a really good burn phase, a rush to the end, where it's like, yes, the Orgas OA is, you're doing phase 1, but kind of like the first part of phase 1, so it's easier, but now it's got extra mechanics on top of it as well. I thought that was a really neat way of doing things. In the B tier as well, I'm going to put in Queen Azshara. Yeah, Queen Azshara, the last boss. I think a lot of people hated Queen Azshara. Again, for me, I actually quite liked it. Apart from a few things, but generally speaking, I thought that the fight, generally speaking, was very fun. I liked the multiple phases. I thought they were cool, and I actually quite enjoyed the decree phases. It was just a little bit different. It was something a little interesting to do. Obviously quite simple and straightforward with weak auras, but still, it was a nice break of pace, which I thought was good. One thing I didn't like in this fight, again, was same as the cool. You've timings in terms of when you push phases. And I did not like that very much. So for example, in phase 1, you can, if you have enough DPS, push through and phase that early, but that's difficult to do. So generally speaking, most people are doing the strategy of stopping DPS in phase 1, because again, there'll be these arcane orbs you have to soak, and if you phase during that, you need to stack up for the Star of the Decrees. Well, you can't soak these arcane orbs, and they're all gonna blow up, and you're gonna die. So that part was a little bit annoying. Then in phase 2 as well. Phase 2 is the part of the fight I didn't particularly like. That's when Azshara first activates, and there's really nothing going on in that phase. There's devoted ads which spawn in, so a bunch of ads go towards the middle, and you just, you know, CC them in the middle and blow them up with AoE. It's very simple. And then she does like one set of dispels. It's very simple. Honestly, I kind of felt like phase 2 could have just been removed from the fight, and it probably would have worked out just fine. But yeah, it was a long fight, lots of phases. And generally speaking, I like them. Actually, that was the one thing I meant to say. Phase 2 also had an annoying DPS check where if you push too fast, you'd be out of position with dispels. There was a beacon cast, which was an awkward DPS check to beat. And then, again, you had a bunch of DPS checks to push her at just the specific right moment. Where like the kind of the enrage, if you will, the final DPS check you need to beat on that phase 2 was that an indomitable ad would spawn in, so a massive ad you could never kill, which would put a ton of charges into the wards on the floor. So that wasn't great. You know, to try to really finick your way through the DPS stuff, I kind of just gave up on doing that as the raid lead and just said, you know what, we'll hit the DPS check we want most of the time and we can survive. Otherwise, it's not too bad, but it's just kind of annoying because it's such a hassle to coordinate. But yeah, apart from that, it's a decent fight. I thought phase 3 was really cool. Phase 4 I thought was great. She had a really good burn phase, I thought, where there's actual mechanics still happening that matter, and it felt really epic when you got there, because it's such a long fight too, that when you finally start getting into those burn phases, it feels like an epic adventure. So I thought that was nice. Line of sight stuff was probably the biggest drawback for people in this, and that was obviously annoying. Line of sight for dispels, line of sight for resetting stacks. Yeah, it was a pain in the butt. And kind of counterintuitive because you're going around pillars which are circular, or well, they're cylindrical, I suppose, but you know, the line of sight worked in weird ways around those, and there'd be kind of invisible hitboxes and stuff for spears being thrown. It was a bit of a hassle, but yeah, Azshara, she was okay. I liked her more than most people did, I think. I liked her more than most, and I had fun doing the boss for sure, albeit with some frustrating aspects. All right, then going into the B tier finally as well, I'm going to put in Lady Ashvane. Again, Lady Ashvane I thought was a good, solid fight. It was basically the wall boss, the tough boss of the instance, the first hard mythic boss that you're going to do. Or, well, there was one other that was pretty hard that you do early on as well, which we'll come to. But Ashvane was the wall that stopped and frustrated a lot of guilds. I thought this is a really fun boss. I mean, I would put it at the top of the B tier here. And I'd almost put her in the A tier. I almost would, because I think that she was really fun. Again, a very simple boss. She leaves these patches on the ground as she goes. So kind of controlling the space of the area is important. You want to control where those patches go, the tanks do, so that it doesn't fill up the whole area. And then you're trying to, eventually she has 2 phases. She has her shield phase and her vulnerable phase. So the shield phase, you have to just damage through her shield. And then once that shield is broken, she's vulnerable, and you can actually start to damage her health. And then after a while, she refreshes her shield, but it comes back even stronger. Break it again, she's vulnerable for a while, then the shield comes back even stronger. So there's a cool rhythm to the fight, and the phase, it becomes a lot more difficult just because that shield comes back bigger and bigger each time. And during the shield phase, she had some interesting stuff happening where these coral plants would spawn around the room, and they'd have these bubbles which would travel towards her, and you had to soak those bubbles. It left a permanent dot on you, which hurt quite a lot if you got multiple stacks. You had to stop those reaching her, or they'd refill the shield. And then in phase 2, in her vulnerable phase, you'd have 6 players be linked, so you'd have 3 pairs. So 2 people would have a beam would form between them, where they'd get marks on their head, and then after a timer counted down, a laser beam would fire between them, which would cut the coral and blow up the coral plants. So you could destroy the coral plants like that. So it's kind of I thought it was a really fun fight where you've got interesting movement around, stopping those orbs, which could come from kind of a variety of different angles. So you have to think about that. And then like a bit of coordination between, again, 6 random players would have to coordinate and actually smash the coral. Obviously, it could be a little bit frustrating to progress on that fight. You know, if some people can't do the coral cutting right, that gets quite annoying. But nonetheless, I thought it was a really fun boss. And you could deal with it in a few different ways. Like, we started with a 3-tank strat for a while, just having a 3rd tank soak all the blobs and then ultimately die. And then, yeah, you could have different ways of doing it. You could have a different amount of healers, that sort of thing. So it was quite fun and quite unique. And I did like the whole cyclical nature of the fight, and then how each cycle would become progressively more difficult, because the bigger shield meant more bubbles, meant a lot more damage, a lot more dots, and the longer the phase went, I mean, the more Carls are spawning, the more to break, that sort of thing. So it got pretty intense. And then, of course, after a little bit into the tier, you could just push her in 2 vulnerable phases. So it became like a really big DPS race and DPS check to just nuke her in those shorter windows and not to worry about the shield so much. That was cool. Then finally in the A tier, I got the last 2 bosses. I'm going to put Queen's Court in here in the A tier for me. I really enjoyed Queen's Court. I thought it was a really fun sort of end tier boss with lots of coordination needed. And yeah, it was just a bit of a blast. The idea of this is that you're alternating between decree phases. I thought that this fight on Heroic was pretty terrible. I thought this fight on Mythic was wonderful. But essentially, they keep going through different decrees. You're fighting 2 bosses all the time who need to be separated. But the decrees, it will essentially cut off a different chunk of the room. So you're basically always moving around the room as like a different flag lights up and starts pulsing out a damage aura around it. So you're moving around the room to use the free space. So you got this cool rotation going around, and the flags change. I think it's every 30 seconds. So every 30 seconds you got this new decree. I think there's like 5 of them. So it's just go around the room. I think like 2 or 3 times you go around the room dealing with these different decrees that happen, which is pretty awesome. Like on top of the basic abilities of the bosses. And the decrees did a whole bunch of different stuff. So like there's form ranks, which would do like these 3 different patterns of soaking circles on the ground that you need to stand in to soak them. Otherwise, they wipe your raid. So the idea, just standing in formation, pretty cool. There's one where you couldn't cast the same ability twice in a row, which is really annoying for some classes. So that one was a bit hit or miss for sure. Standalone was an interesting one where you couldn't stand on top of any other player. So you had to kind of carefully calculate where you were going to spread and stand based off of certain other mechanics. There was deferred sentence where you couldn't move. It would build up a damage stacks, so you could move to drop those stacks. So you wanted, again, to time your movement. You didn't want too many stacks, but you also didn't want to move too much and keep resetting too quickly. And yeah, like a whole bunch of stuff like that, which I think is really fun and interesting. And just the idea of movement and it just being a very scripted fight. Everything happens like at the same time, every single time. Very scripted, very organized. I thought that was really fun and really enjoyable. Like a really choreographed dance, which I thought fit thematically in the idea of being like a sort of noble's court and like the court etiquette and all of that. I thought it really captured that idea well. It was just super fun. I really enjoyed it. It's one of my favorite bosses from the raid, and probably one that I'll remember as being a very good boss for probably a long time. And then also in the A tier, I'm going to put in the first boss of the instance, who I think is arguably the best boss, in fact, which is the Abyssal Commander Severa. So this was a super fun boss. This one was really good. The only bad thing I have to say about this boss was that it was probably too hard for a first boss. She was way harder than the second 2 bosses, the fish and the big boy. She was a lot harder than that. So it was a bit weird in terms of progress. You come into the raid, you got one first boss who's quite tough, especially at the start of like obviously she's easy now, but at the start, when we were coming into the raid with like 0 gear pretty much, she was really hard. But then you had 2 really easy bosses, and then you hit Ashvane, who was again really hard. So it was kind of a weird rhythm to the raid. But her mechanics were just super fun. The idea is that half the raid get poison marks, half the raid get frost marks, and those keep stacking up. And the poison mark, again, these are dots that keep intensifying. The poison one reduces your healing taken, the frost one reduces your movement speed. And to reset the mark, you have to touch something of the opposite mark. So there'd be poison pools on the ground and ice pools on the ground. You could touch an opposite pool, you could touch an opposite player to reset your stacks, but resetting the stacks did a big bunch of damage to your raid. So it's like that. It was actually quite a tricky little dance there of trying to manage your stacks versus how often can I reset and damage the raid. It was a very intensive fight for healers in particular, and the DPS check at the start was really tough as well, actually, because again, the healing was so tough. You kind of wanted to bring as many healers as possible, but you also didn't want the boss to enrage, which was quite possible at the start. Then she had some other, again, fun mechanics, I thought. She had, like, overflow, so one person would just get their debuff would, like, supercharge, and with them, that's what would drop these pools down after a few seconds, but they could go and clump with other players with the same mark to drop the pool and spread those soaks. Or then she had her barrage, where she'd fire off all these little missiles, she'd build up all these missiles around her, and then fire them all off in, like, random little orders around her in this big barrage. And they could be, on one side of her, they'd be poison, on one side they'd be frost. So you could kind of, again, play around that. Again, you want to, like, move back, dodge through, and you kind of weave your way through this barrage. I thought it was a really fun mechanic with actual gameplay. It mattered. You could use it to reset your stacks potentially, but that could be dangerous. You only wanted to do it when that was assigned to happen. But yeah, it was just a really cool fight, a really simple idea in a way. But I thought she was a great boss. I mean, I think if this boss was, like, tuned harder and put as, like, you know, put as, like, the third last boss of an instance or something, you could totally have it work like that and just be, like, a really intensive damage check. Maybe a little simple for some of those last bosses. You could have an extra mechanic or two in there. But I thought she was just a great boss. And like I said, pretty much the only criticism I have of this boss at all was that it was, compared to the other two bosses, kind of weirdly difficult. But on the whole, I thought, yeah, super fun, super great, and yeah, there you guys go. That was the Eternal Palace. So on the whole, I thought it was quite a solid raid. We've 8 bosses here, and certainly I thought 5 of them were quite good. I thought most of these bosses had some little issues here. Like, I didn't like the 3 tanking stuff. Not a fan of that. The line of sight stuff in Azshara was definitely a little bit annoying, but other than that, I thought these bosses were really good. I thought these bosses were just generally very good. And then we've got some other bosses which, you know, were either just a little bit simple, and these 2 guys, or with Sakul that had, I felt, a bunch of kind of weird, gimmicky, and annoying gameplay issues, particularly from a raid lead perspective. But there you go. That's what I think of Mythic Eternal Palace. Let me know what you think. What did you like about the bosses? What didn't you? And I will see you guys next time. Bye-bye.